Chapter 16 of Across the Andes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mary T. Across the Andes by Charles Johnson Post. Opening up the jungle. Among the Cholo workmen, it developed that each preferred to cook for himself, with his own little pot and over his own individual fire. It was too great a waste of time and energy to have 18 men building 18 fires 3 times a day in order to cook their 54 meals. So a compromise was effected. The original Cholo cook, who was good for nothing, kept up one long fire on which the row of pots simmered. After each meal, enough would be issued to each pot owner for the next meal. In the early morning, the general day's rations were issued. The Cholos wrapped them in smudgy bandanas and laid them away beneath their bunks. Their bunk shack of cane, charro, being the first thing attended to, and then traded back and forth according to fancy. A little rice for a gristly shin bone of cholona, or some chancaca for a bit of coffee or chuño. Cocoa formed a regular part of the ration, and was regularly used by all the workmen. Agamemnon, as a cook, developed famously. As to results, one could never properly place the blame upon him. With the exact and retentive memory of the utterly illiterate, he followed directions with absolute fidelity. He was of the same family as that famous cook who, after having been instructed by the missus in cake-making, invariably threw away the first 2 eggs because in the original effort the first 2 had proved to be undesirable citizens. Agamemnon was of this order, yet he never failed to throw in all the frills of table service he could think of. This came from his days of stewarding on the Pacific coasters. Every morning he appeared with a box lid for a tray set forth in fresh green jungle leaves, and on it a species of muffin he had developed, or the boiled green platanos that took the place of bread, a tin can of jam, or some turtle eggs if we had been lucky in a trade with some passing battalion of Lecos. Coffee he served with a flourish, and from his campfire below the bank on which our tent was pitched, he would bring up a bucket of hot water with which he could keep a continual service of clean camp plates. In the intervals at meals he stood back and fanned off the wild bees that flocked to the jam and condensed milk tins. 2 little holes pricked in the milk tins guarded them, but with the jam it was different. Often a half tin of jam had to be thrown away, the contents solid with reckless, greedy bee suicides. They would light on the jam while it was on the way to your lips, or stow away on the underside of the jammed muffin, compelling the utmost vigilance on the penalty of a diet of raw bees. With all the reckless handling they received, not one of them stung. It was the ant that was the irritable, hot-weaponed party who went out a-jousting from the sheer lust of battle. They were infinite in variety, from the sluggish white ant that left the table a hollow shell of sawdust, on up to the leaf-cutters and army ants, to whom nothing was so precious as the straight line in which they were going. But the worst, the most vicious and accursed, was the large black variety, one of whom made a murderous attack upon me in the darkness. He is nearly an inch in length. To the Lecos he is known as bunoista, and they also assert that he lives in very small communities in holes in the ground, not building the ordinary nests. Agamemnon had been stung, and had promptly, darky fashion, tied a rag round his head and stayed in his tent all night groaning. A Cholo boy was stung, and he too tied a rag around his head and groaned throughout the night. It seemed absurd for a mere sting to have that effect, and I looked upon them with proper scorn. I have been stung by hornets and scorpions, and the latter seemed to me, at the time, as the ultimate of all stinging sensations. I was wrong. For some reason, these bunoistes seemed to have a love for passing themselves in review up the guy rope, along the ridge pole, and down the other guy rope of the tent. By observing, I noticed that no sooner did the Buonoisti reach the bottom of the guy rope than he started back to the front guy and began another tour. One evening I stepped out of the darkness. My foot caught on a root and I stumbled. I clutched for the guy rope to save myself, and the instant my hand touched, the forefinger connected with a high-voltage current that gave all the sensations of a red-hot sausage grinder. I had caught a Buonoisti on his way up the guy rope. A delayed lantern revealed a crippled Buonoisti and a finger with an almost invisible sting on the first joint. There was no swelling, nor did any follow at any time. Yet the pain was intense. I could feel it spreading from the finger to the hand, and then, slowly with an acute torture that brought no relieving numbness, up to the shoulder. There it halted. But for hours, as the camp watch showed, there was no sleep possible, not until the exhaustion from pain paved the way. For 3 days the effects lingered in the form of a bruised sensitiveness that made that arm all but useless. A scorpion sting is a gentle tickle compared with the Buonoisti. Slowly the camp grew. A patch of jungle was cleared on the high bank above the river, beyond the reach of any sudden freshet. In the early days of the camp, one of these freshets descended from the Andean foothills, and before the last of the outfit had been carried to the high bank, the Cholos were struggling in a current up to their belts, or portaging by the aid of poles held out to steady them. Where the first hasty camp had been was a torrent of muddy rivers and a tiny island, cut off from us by a creek torn in the bank by the flooding river. The water rose 5 inches a minute for about 8 feet, and then slowly went back during the night a few inches. For something like 11 miles down this river, there was placer gold. Wherever a sandbar or a sandbank showed it was of black, gold-bearing sand. Anywhere you washed, you got a trace or color in the pan, and sometimes 30 or 40 bright flecks of gold glittering against the rusty iron bottom. But with that current, the uncertain rise of freshets, the distance from civilization and main supplies, only an Indian could wash out dirt and make a living at it. The plan was to prospect the placer area extensively and establish a basis for the permanent working camp that was to follow. The gold was there, but how deep to bedrock or hardpan, whether it were best to work by dredge or shaft or open workings, these were the questions that had arisen back in the world of civilization and were solved on the basis of the results of this first camp. From the bank at the water's edge there stretched back a mass of matted jungle, creepers, vines, and underbrush, and above, a mass of vines that tangled the treetops in great patches of aerial islands. Paths had to be cut, some kind of a working map made, the natural difficulties and conditions set forth, and the beginnings of the permanent camp put in form. The 18 men were swallowed up in the jungle. The clearing was scarcely made and burned before the jungle was again closing in and rising from the ground like sown dragon's teeth. And slowly progress was made, and up and down the river the camp became known, and voyaging rubber traders and crews stopped as at a port of call. One expedition passed the midday breakfast with us. Its head was an Englishman, a wiry, frontier-hardened man who was on a punitive expedition at the head of his men, rubber pickers, bolseros, and headquarters men from his barraca. Somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of acres that represented the rubber domain, of which he was chief there, was a boundary dispute. His trees had been raided, and here, like a feudal baron, or rather like a salaried feudal baron, the fief of a plush-cushioned rocking-chair lord of a board of directors the half of 7 seas away, he was at the head of his 2 Cayapos and 14 Winchesters, and a scattering of 20 bore, miserable trade guns, with their trade powder in gaudy red tins and a month's rations for the expedition. Again, a couple of Englishmen who had drifted down to the Ruanabaque, the last settlement of the frontier from this side of the continent, stopped as they were slowly poling up the river with a couple of new dugouts. Their crew was of Takana Indians, and these dugouts were the first known on the river, In effect, these men had independently invented the whaleback. The endless series of rapids made the Cayapo, with its baggage platform, a poor freighter. In their mahogany dugouts they had a series of deck hatches that, when the cargo was on board, were bolted down over rubber gaskets. Rubber pure as it came from the tree and spread with a bundle of parrot feathers over a sheet of coarse muslin and then smoked in a hot blue palm smoke. With a couple of these dugouts lashed together, they proposed to shoot the little cañons and the nube, the incagaro, the diablo pintado, and the ratama. And they did, too, dropping paddles and clinging with tooth and claw to the bare wet decks on which they had omitted to put cleats or rope holds. But it was an eminently successful venture, and they slowly chipped away with the adze and axe until on their next trip they had a fleet of 7 dugouts, each some 35 to 40 feet in length, and from a single log of caobo, mahogany, or palo maria, with which they could run the river in either the dry or wet season. With balsas and cayapos, as our long delay in Mapiri showed, only under the pressure of emergency was it possible to get up the river. As the work progressed, it became evident that our original outfit was not sufficient to make any adequate preliminary development. It was not possible to get to bedrock without some machinery, a pump, and some means of sawing lumber for sheet piling. The cholos were perfectly useless at whipsawing a log. We tried them, and the work was too grueling. They were curiously inefficient in any line outside of their narrow experience. A block and tackle was an unsolved riddle, although they recognized its power. They would take it along cheerfully in the morning and then later send for someone to come up and work it. They could never fathom which rope to pull. Main strength and awkwardness were their reliance, and when these failed, caramba, what more could be done? According to the custom of the montaña, they had been contracted for 6 months before a judge, an intendente, and amid all sorts of mystic ceremonials of red tape without which Bolivian law and custom looks askance. 5 weeks had been a dead loss in Mapiri, and 2 weeks more for gathering them and the time of actual transportation, and then almost 2 months of work in camp came perilously near the expiration of their contracts, when it was considered necessary to bring in a new gang. These were hungry to get back to their villages and join in the high-class carnivals and drunken dances. Some of the cholos were worthless, while others would come back again after a rest on the other side of the Andes. Segorondo, the squat little drunkard, was one of the best men in the gang, and he had added a new adornment to his peculiarly unattractive exterior. In a fight with the major domo, he had had his head laid open with a machete, from over his right eye to almost the back of his neck. It was a mere scalp wound, fortunately for Segorondo, as the machete glanced. It took 6 men to hold him while he was stitched up with 6 stitches. Beauty was to him no object compared with the pain of stitching, and when our surgical job was over, the effect of only 6 irregular stitches in a 12-inch cut may be imagined. Then we bandaged him securely, gave him an extra drink of cañaça, and once more he grinned cheerfully. Later he and his antagonist appeared for another drink, each affectionately embracing the other. Without the slightest difficulty the wound healed, leaving an interesting scalloped pattern that was a source of much pride to its owner. But it was obviously necessary to get out to the coast for machinery, supplies, and another gang of workers. A proprio, a messenger, was sent overland up the river to notify the Lecco rivermen a few miles above, and a week later 4 balsas and 10 lecos swung around the bend under the bank in the dawn, and we started. The crew of the balsa is 2 men, 1 fore and 1 aft of the platform, with poles or a jungle vine for a drag rope. It is not safe for more than 1 passenger to each balsa, for the narrow raft of a wood almost as light as cork is lightly balanced as a canoe. There is no freight worked up the river except rubber, and of that the big polachas are wedged in under the stilts of the platform. Slowly the little fleet of balsas hugged the shore, poling against the current. Then across the river appeared a stretch of narrow beach, and the poles were dropped and the balsas swung out across the current to the other side. Here the vine drag rope would come in use with 1 lecco pulling and the other poling, and fairly rapid progress could be made. There was a short stop at a tiny Lecco settlement at Incagara, where the chief Lecco, the cacique, lived. He was a shy, bashful, good-natured old man who invited us into his hut, where we gave him the customary drink. On the grass matting was an old woman, a very old woman, his mother, the cacique explained. She was past all intelligence and in the last stages of senile dissolution. Huddled up in a corner, she murmured and clucked to herself, meanwhile playing aimlessly with an empty pot and a few bits of grass. The dulled eyes gave no signs of interest or understanding when the old man spoke to her. She suggested more an animal, an aimless, warped little monkey rather than a human being. A few months later she died of old age, and the old cacique, her son, came with her body wrapped in a frayed matting and borrowed a pick to dig a grave. He obviously was deeply grieved in the subterranean Indian way, and yet there was not the slightest vestige of ceremonial or belief connected with her death. She was dead, a hole in the ground was necessary, and there alone, and by himself, and full of grief, the old man dug it in the remote jungle, without any more curiosity in death or religious expression than he would have felt in digging a post-hole for a new hut. We bought a few platanos and yuccas from this place and made our breakfast there. 2 hours after leaving, a freshet from the rains in the mountains ahead suddenly made itself felt, and we were forced to camp till it went down a little. We did not move until the next morning. End of chapter 16. Read by Mary T., San Diego, California, November 2nd, 2023.